Hello. Hello. Hello, can anyone hear me so that we can proceed?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, hello everyone. I really hope you can hear me and I hope it's clear enough. And thank you for joining us. My name is Nasrin Alamin. I work with South Africa and I will be your host for this program. Welcome to Business Unusual, Food Security in Crisis. The Business Unusual webinars are aimed at addressing critical issues in Africa that the COVID pandemic could possibly aggravate, which may lead to civil unrest or humanitarian crisis. The Business Unusual webinars lays ground for interactive discourse with experts on how to respond to or tackle these challenges. So today, our session will focus on food systems in Africa and the impact the pandemic could have on food accessibility, small-scale farmers, nutrition, agribusiness value chains, and overall food security in Africa. Speaking on global food crisis is Mr. Patrick Worms. He is the Senior Science Policy Advisor at World Agroforestry Federation and the President of European Agroforestry Federation. So, Mr. Worms, what can you tell us about how the pandemic could affect global food systems around the world with a bit of emphasis on Africa?
Thank you, Nasreen, for giving me this opportunity to talk about this most important of subjects, because before we are social animals and before we are learned animals, we are eating animals. And unless there is food on the table, civilization cannot continue. And there we have good, bad, and awful news. The good news is that so far world food stocks are very healthy. We have the reserves to feed everyone, and the farms are not subject to any major problems in the world's breadbaskets. The worst news, however, is that so many people have lost their jobs that they're finding it difficult to afford that food. So hunger is rising, especially in the cities of the southern world where social welfare mechanisms do not operate as well or are absent. And indeed, the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme is suggesting that about 260 to 270 million people, about half the current population of Africa, if you like, could be facing famine or very serious hunger by the end of this year. So the challenge for the world community is to figure out how to get that food into the bellies of people who have lost their livelihoods. And let's remember here that most of these people have no savings, they're very poor to begin with, and they operate largely in the informal economy. They are the boda drivers, they are the guy who's selling you the SIM card top up, they are the people who are laboring on the fields of rich landowners. They are all these people whom we normally do not think of too much. So that's the first problem. How do we make sure that these people stay fed? And happily, it's not an insurmountable problem. We have, over the last 20 to 30 years, made massive, massive progress in the way we deal with famine in the context of catastrophes of various kinds. And so we have the mechanisms in place. Now, whether the world would be generous enough to deal with that when it has its own problems, after all, everybody's facing the virus, is a completely different question. And so far, what we can see is that places like Europe or China are stepping up to the challenge and putting money in the kitty, while Mr. Trump's America is doing so far more hesitantly. Then there is a longer term problem to do with food security, and that has to do with the way our food system is actually organized. Right now, we are treating nature as if it was a spreadsheet or as if it was a construction site. The idea is you take a piece of land, you get rid of everything that grows on that piece of land, all the trees, all the plants, all the animals. You prepare a seed bed, you put your seeds down, You give those seeds exactly what they need in terms of fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, and irrigation. And at the end of the growing season, you collect a good crop. It works, but it doesn't work sustainably. And what that word means is simply that it doesn't work in the long term. It only works for a few years, because every time you do that, you damage your soil a little bit more. Your soil microbiodiversity, all the little bacteria and the worms and the termites that live in that soil, die off. Their bodies are made mostly of carbon, like the bodies of every other living thing. That carbon goes into the atmosphere and helps make climate change worse. Because there's no more carbon in that soil, the soil tends to become more acidic. And that means that the fertilizer you put on that soil becomes less and less effective. So over time, the efficiency of this farming system goes down, while the negatives of that farming system go up. And as if that wasn't bad enough, this is also the perfect environment for creating new pandemics. Because this virus that we're all worried about today, where did it come from? It came from at least two kinds of animals, a bat and a pangolin, and it recombined in a third animal in order to create this particularly destructive virus that we have today. This is not unusual. Viruses recombine all the time. That's what they do. It's their way of having sex, if you like. What is unusual, though, is that these viruses recombine in a way that they become so deadly for humans. And the likelihood here is that this process of recombination happened inside a large population of genetically similar animals. And there's only two such populations in the province of Hubei where the disease started, and that's humans, us, or pigs. And China had to face the consequences of its giant pig industry, of these enormous barns with 500 to 1,000 pigs being raised using modern agricultural techniques. Because what that means is you have 5,000 or 1,000 animals that are genetically identical inside that shed. And so a virus that goes in there can immediately reproduce and infect all of the animals and use that to explore all the possible recombinations. Most of the time, the worst that happens is a few animals die. But if you're really unlucky, and now we were really unlucky, one of these viruses becomes lethal to humans, and then all it takes is for a farm worker to bring it out of the farm into a city for disaster to strike. And if you think this is rare, think again. Over 300 diseases that infect humans have arisen through this kind of process since the Second World War. And over half of them came from livestock, not from wild animals. So this is a recurring problem. And it's not just a problem for our health, it's also a problem for the health of our crops, and it's a problem for the health of our animals. History is replete with examples of famines that were caused because a major crop failed thanks to a blight or a disease. I'm European, so in my case, the one that is most vivid is the Irish potato famine, where a disease killed the potato crop in Ireland, leading to 1/3 of the country dying of hunger, 1/3 of the country emigrating, mostly to the United States, and 1/3 of the country surviving by the skin of their teeth. This happens repeatedly, repeatedly, and repeatedly. And so what we need from our food system is not just that it produces good, cheap, nutritious food to feed all 7.8 billion of us, but also that it does so in a way that minimizes those risks. And the best way of minimizing those risks is to increase the genetic diversity inside your crops and inside your animals. If all your camels are very different from one another, the likelihood that a single virus could go in there, infect all the camels, and bring forth the mutation that gave us the Middle Eastern respiratory virus, a lot more deadly than the current virus, is much, much smaller. If all the camels are identical, it's a lot easier. If all your potatoes are different, the likelihood that one pest would destroy all your potato crop is much, much smaller. If all the potatoes are identical, all it takes is a bit of bad luck and you have one crop destroying an entire, one virus or one pathogen destroying an entire crop. So the name of that game is diversity. And that is actually great news, because that's also the name of the game for resilience. Farming is a hard business. You have droughts, you have storms, you have floods, you have pests, you have disease outbreaks. And the way to protect yourself against those things is to have diversity in your fields. If you have trees in your fields, you can always sell the wood to make some money if your main crop fails, just to give a simple example. If you have a far more complex systems where you have several crops and several types of animals and several types of trees, you are likely to not even notice, economically speaking, a disruption that would destroy a farmer banking on a single crop or a forester banking on a single tree. So you build in resilience that way. And finally, you also do something good for the future of your children and grandchildren, because these more resilient farming systems increase the biodiversity of the soils. The worms and the bugs and the insects and the spiders and the termites, they all come back. And their bodies are made of carbon, as I've said, and they suck that carbon out of the air, the plants do, to feed those animals, and so the carbon gets back into the soil. So it's also one of the very best tools that we have to deal with climate change. So whether you want to fight pandemics, feed the world, resist disruption, or deal with climate change, biodiverse, complex agricultural systems are always key and core to that solution. And with that, Nasreen, if I'm not mistaken, my 15 minutes are up, and I'm very happy to yield the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It was so interesting to learn that this virus itself is a recurring problem, and to see that it affects not just humans, but crops and animals alike. It's very interesting. And I also believe that genetic diversity is key, and that's something to learn there as well. So our next speaker is Mr. Rotimi Williams. He is the founder of Kerosene Farms and the CEO of Kerosene Farms, which is the second biggest rice farm in Nigeria by land size at 45,000 hectares, and also the founder of Resolute 4.0. Mr. Rotimi, what can you say about the projection of the hunger crisis in Africa, considering the circumstances of the pandemic, and how do you think that can be addressed?
Okay. Afternoon, Nazrin. Afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. So I'd like to start by saying that the COVID-19, I mean, in as much as it's caused so much disruption across the world, I guess it has one upside. And for me, that is, it exposes the inefficiencies of the agricultural system or sector in Nigeria and gives us that opportunity to address them. You know, with the lockdown and the pandemic, a lot of questions have been raised. I guess for the ease of understanding, I'll try and break this down into two parts, looking at agriculture or the agribusiness sector as a whole, how it's going to be affected by the lockdown, by looking at the demand side, which is a supply side rather, which is a production, and the demand side, which is for the consumers. Now, if you look at from the production perspective, Nigeria imports a substantial amount of its food. We import, I think about a few years ago, it was up to $2 billion worth of rice annually. That figure, they claim to have dropped substantially, but they don't take into account the amount of rice that's being smuggled into the country. We still have a lot of frozen chicken, frozen turkey imported into Nigeria. So this is a big issue. This poses a big threat to the country. Why? Because a lot of countries have now imposed export restrictions to sort of safeguard some food for their own people in their own countries. One is also particularly tricky to ship food across the world with the pandemic ongoing. If you also look at the FX, foreign exchange for Nigeria with the dwindling oil prices, we're now, I mean, Naira to dollar is trading at about 400, 430 to 1, which again makes it difficult. In the future, if we did choose to import food, it's going to be incredibly expensive at 430 to 1. So even if you did import, how many people will be able to afford this food? Then you look at the closure of the smuggle routes. So the neighboring countries around Nigeria, which are the likes of Togo, Cameroon, Benin Republic, have all closed. They're all on lockdown as well. They closed their borders, mainly their land borders, but there's also very little ships trickling in. So again, the smuggling routes, which sort of covered up for the agricultural sector in Nigeria over the years, is now closed as well. So there's a huge gap that's been created by this. And then if you look at the local market here, to an extent, Nigeria has the capacity to produce its own food, but due to certain issues or inefficiencies in the past, we've not been able to do that. We have pre-existing challenges like insecurity in the rural area. And if you look at 80% of the food produced in Nigeria and consumed in Nigeria is produced in the rural area. So issues that affect the rural area effectively affect food supply. See, the question now is, how would the lockdown affect the rural area? Number one, I spoke to a couple of colleagues that are working in Plateau State, and they confirmed, and for the life of me, I never thought that this would happen. I thought that the rural area, a lot of the restrictions, a lot of the issues or the instructions on lockdown would have been ignored. But it's not been ignored. A lot of the people are keeping to themselves. A lot of farmers are keeping to themselves. So this poses a huge problem, actually. And then you look at the supply of inputs for the next planting season. A lot of the inputs coming from other states, a lot of seeds coming from across the country. There are going to be a lot of issues because interstate traveling is pretty much impossible at this point. So movement of goods up and down is become very difficult. So that's also going to affect the next round of planting. You look at the cost of these inputs, mainly down to the high foreign exchange. A lot of the input suppliers are adjusting their pricing. Then you also add the increase in cost of transportation of these goods across the country. That's a big problem. And then again, mobilization of skilled labor. So I'm going into the next planting season. A lot of my farmers are expected to come from the Jamari region of Bauchi in Nigeria. They're not going to be able to move because they will not be able to justify it. They may not be able to afford the transportation. And even the coordination of that movement will also be impossible. So you add all of these things up and you begin to understand how the lockdown, how COVID-19 pandemic affects the rural area that produces 80% of the food we consume in the entire country. Now, if you take that and you look at the demand side issues, which is from the consumer side, right? As a result of the lockdown, the pandemic globally and also locally, you have the economy has basically been stifled. A lot of entrepreneurs who rely on their daily income to feed are not seeing that money. That cash flow has been stifled. A lot of workers, 9-to-5 workers, again, have not gone to work in over a month, right? Some of them have not received salaries. Some of them have been laid off. Some of them have been put on temporary leave. Again, the cash flow has been stifled. So even if food is available, the question is, what happens? Would it be? It's now an issue of affordability. Will they be able to afford this food? That their disposable income has basically been diminished. And when you take that issue from the demand side, coupled with the supply side, which is production, then you have a whole host of issues of, okay, these people, they can't produce. Even if they did produce, will the consumers be able to afford it? That's a big issue, I think, that needs to be discussed and addressed. But I think going forward, I think that there are measures that the government and perhaps Nigeria as a whole can explore in resolving some of these issues. And I think the first and paramount is to ensure that all farmers in the rural area engage in this round of wet season planting, because basically Nigeria has one cycle, which is the rainy season planting. A lot of the rural farmers cannot afford the dry season when they need to use irrigation. So they focus on one crop a year. If we do not take full advantage of this, then we'll have to wait an entire year to be able to meet up with production. That's a big problem. So the government has to some way, somehow encourage farmers, support farmers to mobilize and get everybody on the farming. That's one. Secondly, you look at things like interventions from the central bank. Again, I've always had issues with this because I believe that the Ministry of Agriculture should have done more in terms of, the Ministry of Agriculture, they understand the landscape, the entire landscape of the country. They should have done more by way of policies and advocacy on how interventions should be put in place to support these local farmers to ensure that they have everything required to produce. I hope that they're able to mobilize funds in time. They're able to get fertilizer in time to some of these farmers in the rural area to be able to achieve their full potential. And by way of policy, I believe that Nigeria also needs to carry out what I call a comparative advantage analysis. I call it by region. Now, what do I mean by this? Region by region has its own diet. So in the Southwest, for example, you have people that consume a lot of cassava, a lot of yam, some rice and whatnot, and the derivatives of this as well. In the northern part, you have a lot of people that consume guinea corn. They consume a bit of rice by way of tuwo shinkafa, their dishes. And in the east as well, they consume a lot of cassava. Now, I believe that the government this presents the best opportunity for the government to own this situation and being to break these things up. So we break that reliance on the likes of rice, for example. The objective at this point should be to consume carbohydrates, not to get what you want or to enjoy the meal you're going to have. It's to consume the essentials. So this gives the government an opportunity to ask regions by region, state by state, to focus on what they are good at producing and that their indigenous or the citizens are accustomed with, right? And I guess we can then build on that post-COVID as well to create a policy out of that whereby we eat what grows around us and stop relying on the likes of rice and imported chicken. Even if you look at chicken, for example, a lot of the feeds are imported. A lot of the corn you consume or that they used to feed this chicken are imported. So I don't know what's going to happen in that industry. I need to keep a close eye on that. That's a potential threat for the entire poultry industry, for example, because I don't know if we produce enough maize to feed both humans and animals at this point. And I think lastly, as well, as part of the solutions the government has to put in place is for logistics to ensure that food gets from farm to fork with minimal post-harvest losses. In the past, we've seen a lot of food dumped on the roadside because it's spent too long on the trucks and it's just been discarded, or it gets to the market and it only has 1 day left, 1 day shelf life left. That has to be minimized. Everything, I mean, there's no room for wastage in where we find ourselves basically. And I think these, for the short-term measures or short-term solutions, these are the sort of things that the government needs to explore now and then start to build on for the medium to the long term. I don't want to delve into too many issues, so we get time for the next speaker to also say something, and then we can deliberate on the issue a bit more.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rotimi. What a great insight. When you say that the issues that affect rural areas effectively affect food supply, I take that powerfully because I think most of the times that's what policy makers don't really see and don't consider when they're making some policies. So I really like that you pointed that out. So our next speaker is Salihu Hamisu. He is the co-founder of Agrico. It's a startup that trains people online on urban farming. I find that very innovative. Malam Salihu, how do you see the pandemic disrupting food access or availability? We have so many factors in play here, including the locusts infestation in Eastern Africa. So in which that alone could maybe create a ripple effect across the continent. So how do you think that can be addressed?
Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm clear, the voice.
You are very clear, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nasrin, for having me. And then very good words from Mr. Rotimi and Mr. Patrick Wams. So to build on that, I believe that in the past, food crisis is majorly driven by conflicts or insecurity and extreme weather conditions, and sometimes economic problems. But today, we are witnessing an unprecedented impact of climate change and disease pandemic on food supply across countries in Africa. And this is no doubt that the novel coronavirus pandemic is having an unprecedented threat on food systems and economic outlook of nations. Before this disease became a pandemic, data from the WFP, the World Food Program, shows that almost 135 million people are in acute shortage of food across 55 countries and territories. And that the impact of this coronavirus and the destructive infestation of the desert locusts in East Africa are already threatening to increase this number to about 265 million people, just like Mr. Patrick mentioned. And then authorities across Africa are facing a decision trade-off, between saving the lives and livelihoods of their citizens or saving them from catching the coronavirus and having them die of hunger. So to prevent this scenario from happening, we need to understand the current food situation in Africa and then make an educated guess or forecast, in the possible short term, perhaps from our learning of the experience of the 2014-16 Ebola crisis and the 2007-8 global food crisis. But the question is, how would the pandemic affect food systems in African countries? And then to answer your question, I think we don't only need to look at the availability and accessibility of food, but as well as affordability, because it makes no sense if the food is available and people can still afford it because of losing unemployment, just like Mr. Patrick pointed. So, but before I dig deeper into these issues, I think it's imperative that we understand that food is a hyperlocal issue that is influenced largely by local issues in demand, supply, and other market conditions. Therefore, it requires local responses. And then there is a striking difference between the global situation of food and the domestic or local situation of food. For example, just like Mr. Parkry said, that there's little disruption in the global food system. The food supply is being stable and prices are good. But this is not the case in local markets. Food prices, especially, for example, in Kano and other part of northern Nigeria, have surged largely due to market speculation and scarcity. So now the issue of food availability, I believe that it's a function of whether farmers can continue to produce food and whether their produce will be available in the local market. The irony here is that the small the farmers that are responsible for at least 70% of food production in countries like Nigeria are already the most vulnerable populations at the risk of food insecurity and the impact of the pandemic. Now, lessons from the recent Ebola outbreak have shown that border closures and restrictions in movement of people and goods to contain the spread of the disease had seriously impacted on the ability of the farmers to access markets, to buy inputs for production and then as well sell their produce at the end of the growing season. So it is also clear that these measures may also affect the availability and movement of seasonal labor, for food production during peak periods of demand, just like Mr. Rotimi mentioned with his rice farm. So this could be impounded in other African countries that are already facing the destructive desert locust infestation, the desert locust infestation that is spreading like wildfire across countries in the Horn of Africa. So countries like Somalia, Kenya and Ethiopia have already witnessed rounds of destructive swarms of these locusts in their millions or billions, perhaps the largest they have seen in about 70 years. So these pests are so destructive that they scourge on any green matter they come across, destroying food crops and pasture for livestock. So sadly, the continent is facing yet another wave of young adults of this pests that are feared to be at least 20 times more destructive than the recent infestations. So farmers in countries like Kenya have already started planting on the onset of rains, probably around last month and May, and they will be due for harvest around July, which is going to coincide with the upcoming swarm of billions of these desert locusts. So authorities fear that this wave may affect at least 100% of farmers' fields, further worsening the food crisis in the region. So these have a ripple effect, as these insects have already spread to about 23 countries now and counting. Most spread is the issue of the fall armyworm of maize as well. Very little people talk about this now, but this is in several countries in West Africa and Sahel. Although it's not proven to be as destructive as the locust, but what can we say with the climate change? So in essence, what I'm trying to say is the general outlook of food availability in these times of crisis in African countries is in a terrible shape until and unless authorities put in place policies that will strengthen the food value chain resilience and support smallholder farmers with cash to enable them to restart production. We have seen how countries like Cote d'Ivoire, for example, are investing funds to provide production kits to farmers to help them with production. Now, the second aspect is food affordability. And as I explained earlier, the food market on a global scale is relatively stable, but food prices and affordability in local markets in Africa are surging as we speak because of local logistical problems, just like Mr. Rotimi mentioned, scarcity, market speculation, and inflation caused by depreciation of local currencies in relation to the US dollar. So this, however, is expected to slow down, as the panic demands diminishes along other measures. So the concept of food affordability is an economic decision and is directly related to the purchasing power and the expendable income of families across Africa. And rising unemployment, fueled by the crumbling of businesses as a result of the lockdown, will severely reduce families' purchasing power. This is, however, likely to change the consumer dietary patterns and behaviors. People will be buying more cheap carbohydrates and non-perishables and less of high-valued crops and protein sources as well, just like Mr. Patrick mentioned. Mr. Rotimi mentioned. So the issue of affordability can be reversed when government and donor organizations increase the resilience of families to economic shocks by handing out cash transfers, especially to vulnerable population in IDP camps and crisis hit areas. In African countries like Burkina Faso, we've seen how governments are opening food shops, to sell cereals at a reduced price as a response to the hiking food prices in the urban centers. So to conclude, there is an imminent threat to food security in African countries, as a result of the global pandemic, as compounded by other underlying issues like the locust infestation in Eastern Africa and the fall armyworm in other parts of the continent. So we are therefore calling for a global cooperation for authorities at global, regional, and sub-regional levels to enforce policies that will boost the resilience of food systems worldwide. And then youth like me can play a vital role in demanding for governments to take actions through activism. There is no better time than humanity needs on them now. So we should hold our government responsible for the food situations in our communities. I would like to end with this thought that food is a hyperlocal issue. It's an issue of availability, affordability, and accessibility of food by individuals and families in our local communities, and that food is a fundamental human right, and that governments are responsible for making this happen. Thank you so much. I think that's all.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Salu. Just to compound on what you just said, I also think that many communities, especially in East Africa, are going to feel the effects of the locust infestation more than the pandemic itself. And when you spoke about funding and aid in this sector, and you mentioned cash transfer, I don't really think of funding alone is enough. I think government need strategic measures to address these issues, because most of the times it's not like there isn't funding. The funding is there, the money is there to address these issues, but it's just the measures taken to address them that aren't effective enough. I also think this is not just an East African problem, it's a continental wide problem, and I think the African Union can do better in addressing this issue. So right now we're going to have an open discussion with all the panel. I'm interested to see what they will propose as responses to what we've just discussed. And I would also like to see if we have any objection or something to add towards what their counterparts say. So let's hear from them.
Thank you, Nasreen. How would you like us to do this? Would you like us to just have an open conversation, or do you want us to do it in a particular order?
No, just open.
Okay. Well, let me jump into the lion's den. Rotimi, you said one thing that, I mean, I agree with everything you said, except one thing. And this was, and I may be misquoting you here, we have to get people to eat their carbohydrates, not to enjoy them. You said something along those lines, and you were using this to lead to a comment that we have to encourage people to eat what grows locally rather than to ask for exotic luxuries like rice or chicken. And of course, I agree with you. But as somebody who's also spent a little bit of time looking at the marketing of ideas, I think we have to tell people that they have to enjoy their food and that they would enjoy their food even more if they move away from these impractical staples. But that's really a quibble. On the issue of the locusts, it's not just the locusts. There's all sorts of things going on that are threatening our food supply. Salihu, you mentioned the fall armyworm, and that's something that we are working on. Fall armyworm is an absolute bitch to treat because the insect burrows into the plant in such a way that spraying it with pesticides is not going to have much of an impact. It turns out that the best way of managing fall armyworm is a form of push-pull, meaning that you plant a combination of plants around your maize system, around your maize field, to trap these insects and make sure they get destroyed there. And we're doing some work, we meaning World Agroforestry, we're doing some work on testing this in various combinations in Zambia at the moment, and we're quite pleased with the results. And in fact, you often find that the way of dealing with the most complex problems is to try to exploit these natural systems. Another very similar example is Salihu. You mentioned the work that they were doing in Côte d'Ivoire. Well, Côte d'Ivoire's major export is, of course, cacao, sorry. And cacao is being threatened by something called CSSV, the cacao swollen shoot disease, swollen shoot virus. And again, right now, the treatment consists of destroying the entire field that has infected trees in it, and then wait a bit and then replant fresh trees. It's extremely expensive for the farmer, of course, and it's very damaging for the economy. And it turns out that you could actually protect cocoa fields even from relatively closely placed CSSV infected fields just by planting the right combination of trees around it into a buffer strip of 5 to 10 meters. So not an enormous buffer strip. And you suddenly get rid of the problem. You're not removing this virus from the landscape, but you're preventing this virus from damaging your farming systems. I'd also like to get back to something that you said, Rotimi, which is absolutely essential. You, Salihu, said quite rightly that food is a hyper-local issue, that it is your belly that grumbles if you cannot afford to buy food in your local market. But at the same time, what Rotimi said is, and what you also mentioned, is crucial. Food is a system, and it is a system that requires inputs, and these inputs are seeds and fertilizer and water and labor. And the various border closures that are being put in place now to try to control this virus are having a massive and very negative impact on this food system. So paradoxically, some of the smallholder farmers that are most removed from the market are going to do best out of this crisis because they are mostly operating in self-sufficiently anyway. And as long as the rains are good and they're not getting any locust infestations, they will at least be able to feed their children. Those who are connected to markets and who depend on inputs of labor, seeds, and all the rest may find their lives as businesses becoming increasingly complicated. And I joined both of those speakers in their hope that the Minister of Agriculture and the leadership in Nigeria understands these issues and figures out how to reopen the border to allow the business of agriculture to resume while still minimizing the danger of the virus spreading.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I think I'll just jump in here. Perhaps I should have elaborated more on the point I made with regards. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so with regards, perhaps people enjoying what they eat. Now, the point I was making is this, right? If you look at the palliatives in Nigeria, particularly in Nigeria, right? Most of the food or food packs being handed out by both government and even some charities include rice. Rice at the point where we are now is a luxury. It's not only expensive, we also do not have a competitive advantage in producing that product, right? What I expected to see in a lot of these gift packs perhaps should have been more yam flour, cassava flour, things that are grown easily. And in government or state government or charities procuring these grains or this carbohydrate also means that money is flowing back to the local farmers who produce them, rather than the
Absolutely.
imported rice, which literally just goes back to the trader. So that's the point I'm making, that by you buying this, you're also boosting your own agricultural system, right?
Absolutely.
And the people who you are gifting them to are also going to enjoy them because they're also used to consuming this sort of carbohydrate. It shouldn't be left to them to decide or to choose what they want, because naturally a typical Nigerian will choose rice and chicken. But right now, where we are, it is a luxury, and I think we can do a lot more by procuring and gifting locally produced goods. That was the point. I was trying to make, and I think I also wanted to add to what Salah said. Good presentation, by the way. When it comes to funding and distribution of funds, I'm going to go more from the macro side, which is the disbursements of money from the likes of the central bank. In the past, before now, we've seen a lot of money being given out to farmers by way of the likes of your anchor borrower scheme and whatnot in the last 2 years. If those monies were effective, if those interventions were effective, we wouldn't be where we are today. So signal is it did not work, right? It didn't work. So the point I'm making here is the government has to do a lot more in terms of how do we give this funding out. We also really need to sort of reshape the entire agricultural landscape. Do we keep doing intervention or giving intervention to farmers, subsistence farmers in the rural area? Or do we also support corporate farmers who are perhaps more resilient when it comes to withstanding shocks, the likes of FX shocks, for example, market shocks, systemic shocks, adverse weather conditions? The more get to, I mean, if my farm flooded today, I could very well look for funding to build a dam. The subsistence farmer can't, he just won't farm. So I think it's gotten to that point where effectiveness of intervention also comes down to how you actually disburse and who you disburse to. So that has to be looked at strategically between the Central Bank of Nigeria and the Ministry of Agriculture for a full effectiveness. And I think that is where we've failed, and a lot more needs to be done so we can avoid issues like this. And another point you made again was in terms of a shift in the preference when it comes to diet, according to as a result of affordability. The problem is a lot of the staple which we think are affordable or cheap are now very expensive. Gari has gone up 63%. This is I think Gari is cassava, right? Cassava flour, right? If I may call it that. It's gone up about 60%. It's basically toe to toe with rice. So what do we do at this point? Because even your substitutes are now very expensive. It's a dilemma, and I think a lot of deliberation still needs to go into this. And you know, the worst part is I still think this is the beginning to the midway phase of the effects of the pandemic. We have not even reached the peak like other countries have reached, and we have not seen the lag effect the lag effect yet. So, and we're already complaining. The question is, where are we going as a nation in terms of food, in terms of affordability? Where are we going? I think these are things that we need to discuss as well.
Okay, let me jump in
Thank you very
here.
much, Rotimi. Salu, is there anything you would like to add to that? Okay, good. Because we
Yeah.
have few minutes.
Okay, great. I think, Mr. Rotimi, you're very right. But my emphasis on smallholder farmers is not just because they are the farmers. It's because they are the most vulnerable part of the population. When you look at food production, almost 70% of them is produced by the smallholder farmers, and they are the most insecure people. So helping them with incentives is not just for boosting the agriculture, but for their own livelihoods. As I said, they are the most vulnerable and the most insecure people, although they are the farmers, because of the size of their production. But as well, I agree that some emphasis, should be paid on, commercial and instituted farmers as well. And then what Mr. Worm said is about the issue of locusts. I completely agree with you. I'm not sure I buy into the idea of using insecticide. That might not be sustainable, at least for the nature, and we might end up compounding and bringing up even more problems that we are not expecting. So as you said, yes, planting trap crops that will help in trapping this insect will work very, very much. And as an agronomist, I also believe that farmers can delay their planting periods, or they should be using short duration crops, at least to escape the peak periods of the infestation. So for example, if we are expecting that the swarm is going to peak around July when they are going to harvest, they can plant short duration crops that are going to harvest in June. So at least they are escaping the peak period. And this is going to help, at no cost, to reduce the impact and as well save their crops.
I
Thank
think
you
we're
very
all
much.
three in agreement. I think we're all three in agreement here, really, because what we do when we take all of these perspectives is we have a truly holistic vision of what the food system is, and in that holistic vision, we know that large commercial farmers have some way of managing risk, which is a financial way of managing risk. If your farm floods, you said, Rotimi, you can build a dam. You have access to finance. You can overcome a lost crop in order to invest and get something better in the future. That's one way of managing risk. Smallholders have other ways of managing risk. For example, by having lots of different things happening on their fields at the same time. If something is being attacked by a crop or the price of by a virus or something else has a dropping price, there are other things there that he can eat or sell. So looking at it holistically, we find that at every scale of production and also at every scale of the transformation, logistics, and retail environment, there are ways in which we can make the system more resilient. We can make it more productive. And that includes using all of the tools at our disposal. And that sometimes does mean pesticides, as is the case for locusts in East Africa. But very often it means agroecological principles, such as buffer strips around infected cocoa fields or fall armyworm infected maize fields. So I think if we bring all of these perspectives to the table, we can actually make the world a paradise of people who are fed good food that is highly nutritious, does not destroy their environment, and resists the inevitable shocks that the natural world brings.
And thank you, Patrick. We need to jump to the questions right now because we are way behind. But I think thank you so much for the open discussion. I really enjoyed, and I hope it's impactful for everyone else. So I think this first question is directed at Rotary, because you're the one that spoke about food wastage, and so it's from Chantel Tom, and he says, when it comes to wastage, is there a chance that the raw food can be flipped to something else? In order to avoid wastage, how efficient is the processing and production sector?
Okay, can I take that?
Yes.
Hello?
Can.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so on thank you, Chantal. I think unfortunately, when we're looking at logistics and wastages, the system here is not it's not solid enough, right, to collect those wastages from point to point. Because you're probably talking about wastages that are on the farm and moving that and using that as something else, perhaps as fuel or whatever, something else, right? But the sort of wastages I'm talking about are the wastages that are on the roadside. And you were getting a lot more of those wastages at the roadside, wastages at the markets and the likes. Government has not built a system that addresses those things. Now, for wastages on the farm, I think a lot has to go to towards the farmers' education. I think Salah can probably talk more on this in terms of post-harvest techniques to minimize losses and whatnot. I think different crops present different what's it called, different challenges and solutions as well. So for rice, for example, a lot of the wastages will come from people throwing away rice because there's stones in it, but then the stones come from pouring the rice on the floor in the first place. So farmers need to be educated not to pour their paddy on the floor before it goes to the mill. These are the sort of things that need to be done. I guess that's pretty easy to do, but for the likes of tomatoes, how do we evacuate them in time? How do we refrigerate them? At what point do we harvest them before it turns red? All those sort of measures have to be put in place. And these are all policy things that I think the government has to do.
Hello?
Sorry, guys, I muted myself and I've been speaking. So, Rotimi, sorry about that. I was saying that I think this is directed to you as well. It's from Abul Hassan, and he said that due to this pandemic situation, how will government ensure food accessibility and affordability to citizens, especially the less privileged ones? I think you just need to recap on this because I remember you mentioned it. So,
Yeah. In terms of affordability, I honestly thought I had an answer, but the more I look at the situation, the dynamics, both from the supply side and the demand side, it poses a question of, okay, so you ask the farmers to produce, they produce at the price or at a certain high cost, and then the product gets to the market. But then the consumer, his disposable income has been diminished, so he also cannot afford what's there. How do you solve that problem? I think that's a pretty tough one. Guys, I don't know if someone can help me out here because I'm also honestly cracking my head as to how you address that challenge, because we've just been looking at one side, that is production, but from the consumer side in terms of affordability, and even if government is going to step in, how do they step in a sustainable manner that they're not only feeding you for 1 or 2 days, but they're feeding you over the period of this lockdown, which we do not know when it will end. I'm not sure anyone can give you an answer to that, to be honest.
Well,
okay,
there's
I
actually
think
been a fair bit of research
before
on that.
I'm sorry, Patrick. Before you jump in, I'm just gonna ask the next question because it's similar to what you're about to address. So this person says that her name is Adaure. She says, if state boundaries are closed in Nigeria, how then would food be distributed to states who do less planting, who plant less food, I guess. So maybe you can just add it to your response.
Okay, Patrick, you want to go? You want to say?
Yeah, very, very rapidly. There's actually been a fair bit of research on doing that, and the best way of feeding people who are going hungry for whatever reason is cash transfer. You just give them money. People are, by and large, much better able to decide by themselves how to use that money than any bureaucracy. You can do it in 2 ways. You can make it unconditional and you can make it conditional. Unconditional cash transfer usually works better in urban settings because people are used to working in an informal economy that has broken down. Give them some money, they will buy food. In a rural setting, very often conditional cash transfer work best. And the best example there is what happened in Tigray in northern Ethiopia, the area that had massive famines 30 years ago. And that is now a paradise of very high agricultural productivity, lots of water, lots of forests, because people's labor was coordinated so that when they received money to buy food, they actually had to work together to do things like build check dams or terracing. So that would be the best way. So in the case of Nigeria, I don't know enough about how the country is organized politically, to say whether that should be done by the federal government or by the state governments, but some sort of cash transfer to people who have lost their income is obviously the way to go.
Okay, so great. Any one of you can answer this, but Caroline made a set of comments and more like a question, and she said, would it part of the solution to actually invest, not a solution for this year, but already starting next season and also during dry season, and has to be funded for the future in regenerative animal production? So wouldn't part of the solution to actually invest in the future be in regenerative animal production, not cattle? I don't know what she means by that, but regenerative production of proteins and by side effects, cell regeneration. So I think she's indicating that shouldn't we invest in regenerative animal production?
Okay, can I just quickly chip in on this? So firstly, I don't think there's a shortage of protein. We do not have a shortage of protein when it comes to beef. For example, the cattle we have are still there. They're still grazing openly in the fields. I think by way of, if you look at the poultry industry, then obviously that's a whole value chain. You have to talk about maize and molasses and maize coming in for poultry industry. Then that's a whole different thing entirely. So the focus really isn't too much on protein, to be honest, because you also have fish. You can go fishing, for example. That's another opportunity there. The real challenge is in crop production, is the carbohydrate production, and that's why we're laying this much focus on it. And also to address the last question that talks about interstate movement of farm produce, I think there's a directive by the federal government to allow any truck carrying or conveying food produce from the farms to any city. So I don't think there should be an issue with that. But in terms of ensuring that food comes to your state, I guess that's now left to the traders. I mean, they're going to want to sell to who has money, right? On a lighter note. So that shouldn't be a problem, to be honest.
Okay, thank you.
If I may come in on this question of regenerative agriculture, is that all right? Can I come in on this question of regenerative agriculture?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that, it's animals on land serve another purpose than providing protein. They are responsible for soil fertility. There is no natural ecosystem without animals. Plants are circled through the stomachs of animals in order to generate fertilizer. It's as simple as that. So some of the most effective systems we have seen in the kind of dry lands that you have in northern Nigeria are systems that combine the growing of crops, the skillful management of animals, and trees. And what you have there is a rapid increase in the productivity of your croplands and a rapid increase in the productivity of your animals. And that's all to the benefit of the farmers. And that's what's known as regenerative agriculture. Again, it's about managing ecosystem services so that you replace expensive things like inputs or irrigation or tractors with cheap or free things like animals or ecosystem services. But it's a much wider debate, and we're coming to the end of this webinar, about what exactly that is made of and how it can be adapted to the unique environments in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We have so many questions coming in and comments, and we're totally out of time. But here is one question that I find interesting from Mohammed Said, and he said, what are the farmers doing themselves to improve security and not heavily relying on government? Because most of our discourse is surrounded by government policies, what government should do, but what are these smallholder farmers doing themselves? Can anyone enlighten us on that?
I think quickly I can just say something, and perhaps I'm sure Salah has something to say as well. I think we have to be fair here, because I mean, it is the government's responsibility, right, to provide certain amenities or infrastructure or whatnot to the rural area. These people would pretty much do everything themselves, right? They pretty much power themselves, they provide their own water, they build their own shelter, they do everything themselves. I mean, and if a little thing, if for whatever it is, if what they're asking is for the government to step in and assist so that food security is achieved, then I don't think it's too much to ask. If you look at fertilizer, seed, inputs, all these things go through a long chain before it actually arrives in the rural area And government also has to make it affordable, because these people can't ordinarily afford all of these inputs at full price. If they could, and if they did, then food prices in the markets, I mean, it would be ridiculous. So I think government will always have a role to play here, and the rural farmers will always need to be supported.
I think
Okay,
in addition to Mr. Rotimi, can I add this? Just one point.
I think I have a
think
question aimed for you, but yes, you can.
okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay, great. I think you're right, Mr. Rotimi, where you said farmers are really resource poor. There's a limitation to what they can actually do. But I think the most important thing that they can do to make sure that food is being produced continuously is for them to stay safe and not catch the virus. These people produce the food that we eat. And if they don't take care of the social distancing and all other medical recommendations, and if they catch this coronavirus, then we are in soup, all of us. So I think the most important thing that they can do is for them to stay safe and clear of the disease.
That's great. So we have a question. I think the last question that we'll take, and then maybe read a few questions from Aziz Salahu, and he says, how best can state governments come to the aid of rural farmers in the post-COVID-19? So post-pandemic, how can government come to the aid of rural farmers? Sally, who would like to respond to this?
Okay, I think the most important thing that government can do is to try and strengthen, the food value chain, and make the system more resilient. Before, our government used to put more attention on production, forgetting about other sector of the value chain. For example, logistics. Nobody was paying attention to that. There are no roads that connect farms to markets and urban cities. So what government should do is try to incorporate all these things. For example, if the government made sure that the value chain works well, the logistics is good, we'll not be talking about all these issues that we're talking about right now, because the food is there, the production is there. But getting this food to the consumers is the problem. So this is the biggest thing that state government should be able to do, is to integrate and strengthen the value chain across all food categories.
And if I may come in here, if I may
sure.
just come in here to add something to that very good answer, and in fact to the answer of Mr. Rotimi as well. Both Salihu and Rotimi pointed out that government has an essential role to play to improve the productivity, the resilience, and the livelihoods of farmers, including smallholder farmers in particular. And I would add to that the most important thing that governments can do is to provide quality extension services, quality advisory services to farmers, to help individual farmers deal with their individual problems and adapt their farming systems to make them more productive and more resilient at minimal cost. Because at the risk of sounding contemptuous, any idiot can rip open a bag of fertilizer and spread it on his field. But it takes a clever farmer to understand how to best manage that fertilizer input so as to reduce the amount of fertilizer you need for a given amount of production. Advisory services help farmers how to manage trees, how to manage livestock, how to manage crops together. They have been the most crucial input to agriculture everywhere around the world, whether it's Germany in the 19th century, Japan in the early 20th century, the rest of Europe after the Second World War. It was always advisory services that helped farmers become better and better and better and better. And if Nigeria needs anything today, more than subsidies for inputs, more than better roads, it is better advisors.
Thank you so much for that apt response. We have lots of questions coming in, but we would have to round up now. Any question that hasn't been answered right now, we would send it to the panelists and they would respond and we share it with the participants. So much to unpack from such an interesting conversation. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us, and thanks to the participants for joining us for Business Unusual, Food Security in Crisis. Again, the Business Unusual is run for interactive discussion calls with experts on how to respond to or tackle the challenges the COVID-19 pandemic might aggravate. We run a monthly session for this program covering diverse topics, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you for joining and have a good day.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you very much
Nasreen.
for organizing it.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Patrick and Salu and all the attendees. Thank you so much.
All right, goodbye,
It was
guys.
a real pleasure. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Goodbye.